Bit of a recap is probably in order because things start getting a little bit on the wacky side as we go along. So, understanding that the area known as Palestine ends up, and obviously the name isn't affixed until the Romans actually take over, and it's very similar to the same way that Deutschland ends up being called Germany in the English speaking part of the world. We follow whatever Latin nom was basically tacked to an area. So the area for in ancient times was controlled by the Jews up until about AD 70, taken over by the pagan Romans for probably about 200 years. As Romans converted to Christianity, Christian Romans took over the area. Then the area was seized in war by the Sassanid Persians, followed by Christian Byzantines, followed by the Islamic Arabic Caliphate, and followed by the Islamic Seljuk Turks, followed by, to a lesser extent, not fully, Christian Frankish Crusaders, and then in the end by Islamic Ottoman Turks. And so a lot of different owners over the time period. Okay. We mentioned a little bit about the diaspora. Essentially, Jewish people started scattering around the Mediterranean and out into the Middle East prior to the civil wars in Israel, and then even more so during, and then obviously when the Romans sacked Jerusalem, there'd be far more spreading out. We mentioned the Maronite Christians in Lebanon because that is where the French come to make their claim in the Middle East on that area. We talk a little bit about Zionism, the idea of creating a Jewish homeland, and initially, uh, Israel, Palestine was not considered feasible as a place to pick just because of the politics of the area. So when we get into the situation going on circa mid 1800s, we have a situation where the Ottoman Empire is crumbling. Everyone wants to kind of break it up, but nobody wants to kind of get involved in the process. So we have French and English more or less helping the Ottomans keep going in order to prevent the Russians from moving in. Uh, we have an increase of Jewish refugees moving to Britain. We have the beginning of Jewish emancipation in Britain. Uh, the recognition of Zionism by the World Jewish Congress, which was centered in Germany at the time, which was actually a safe haven for Jews at that time. The British branch of the Rothschild family, uh, following emancipation, begins paying to relocate expatriate Jews now holding British citizenship to the vicinity of Jerusalem. John Nelson Darby preaches his dispensationalist theology, which spreads heavily through England and a little bit later it works its way to the United States. And this is the change in the mindset from the concept of Israel in the Bible being the church and actually being it interpreted as uh, Israel being a physical location on a map. Uh, and essentially, what happens is Jewish Zionism had existed for quite some time. This would also lead to the creation of Christian Zionism, and that had been on and off throughout Christian movements over the years. But the dominant view uh, beforehand had been that the church and Israel were one and the same, and now Christianity is, I don't know what percentage, but at least split significantly between the ideas of Israel being uh, a place on the map versus the church itself. Okay, so now it starts getting a little bit weird. Uh, we have a movement that occurs in the Ottoman Empire known as the Young Turk movement. It was a movement conspiracy of younger Turkish officers who were looking to reform the Ottoman Empire because they didn't like the direction it was going. They figured it would eventually fail if it kept going the way it did. Now, here's where the weird part comes. So, when these young Turks take over, uh, they're proposing a certain kind of ethno national Turkishness, which is kind of good for Asia Minor and possibly areas going up into Russia, but not necessarily good for the bulk of the Ottoman Empire. So, one of the things that happens is this Young Turks movement spreads through the lodge system there, and the that region had a lodge system that was similar to the Freemasons. And interestingly enough, a lot of the pre revolutionary movement for both the United States and France also swept through lodge systems. And because this lodge system had uh, some symbolism that wasn't entirely Islamic looking in nature, for some reason, the British ambassador, that was not a Freudian slip. There's actually fills in the British ambassador at the time who was letting Great Britain know what was going on in the Ottoman Empire when these young Turks took over. He incorrectly identified them as a Jewish movement. He believed that they were either somehow Turkish Jews who had seized control of the government, or their affiliation with Jewishness made them essentially exceptionally friendly to Jewish ideas. And this isn't true at all, as far as we know. But this report is essentially taken as gospel, and it's a very important building block to the idea of how we end up with modern Israel. So, we're rolling into World War One. Won't get into the much of the details other than the fact it starts off looking like it's going to end up in this gigantic stalemate, and it was for the most part. And both sides were constantly looking for what they called the knockout blow, some new turn of events that would turn the entire war in their favor, and then suddenly, within a month or two, they'd be marching into their enemies' capitals. And so the Turks end up joining World War One, and they kind of trip into the war. Essentially, their goal, the government's goal, was to remain uh, neutral until they could figure out the lay of the land and understand what was going better. Some of the younger officers decided that the Ottoman Empire was missing out, and they actually, without permission of the government, launched their navy into the Black Sea and raided Russian naval bases and ships. And this essentially brings the Turks into the war, not necessarily to the way the government had planned it happening. So once again, the Allies are looking for these knockout blows, and they're thinking, Turkey will be perfect, because they looked at Turks to be a pushover, because they were obviously an inferior race to the great European armies that would be coming down upon them. So, with the advent of the Turks entering the war, this creates a situation where everybody is now trying to figure out, okay, so if the Turks are entering the war, that means the Ottoman Empire isn't going to exist anymore. So the thing that everyone's kind of known has been going to happen for almost 100 years, if not longer, is now a reality, and they needed to plan for that reality. And so we end up having the first problem, and it becomes a problem, is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Uh, Essentially, uh, the French and the British divide up the map of the Middle East. Apparently, their maps were so imprecise that one of the points they were using on the map was actually like the letter Y on the end of one of the words because there was no features on the map to actually tack it to. That may or may not be apocrypha. But so we see the areas of Cilicia, Greater Syria, out to Mosul, including Lebanon and North Palestine becoming French. Armenia ends up becoming a Russian protectorate, and the British would get southern Palestine, Kuwait, and the Gulf states and Arabia. And we see that there's this kind of spheres of influence area here where both sides were a little bit, they were having a hard time dividing up the spoils. So they essentially said, okay, well, we won't actually occupy things here. We'll just, influence the governments here, which both sides were willing to agree to. In the Sykes-Picot Agreement, we also end up with Jerusalem, Constantinople, and the Dardanelles becoming international territory. So there would be some post-agreement where essentially all the nations of the world would have some say-so. More likely, probably a handful of countries in Europe, more likely the victors. So, once Turkey's in the war, they have to decide how they're going to deal with it. And primarily out of the mind of Churchill comes the idea of the invasion of Gallipoli, which is invading the Europeans, invading the straits of the Bosphorus, heading straight for the capital of Constantinople and taking the Turks out in rapid order. Now, the primary goals of Gallipoli were to open up a supply route to the Russians, an all-year, all-weather port, take the Turks out of the war, open a southern front against Austria-Hungary. Initially, the leaders were refusing to free up manpower for the operation, so initially, the British and French tried to do a naval-only operation, and they ended up losing 3 battleships and 5 major ships taken out by mines, and they ended up halting the action. So that's where the actual Gallipoli landings come into play. Essentially, they would begin the 25th of April, 1915. And what they decided to do is rather than divert troops off the front line of Europe, they were basically gobbling up Anzac troops who were on their way to Europe, who were being trained in Egypt along the way. So essentially, New Zealanders and Australians would come by ocean, land in Egypt, get trained, and then be shipped off to the front. In this case, they were trained for the landings in Gallipoli. Now, there were a fair amount of the Jewish expatriates who saw this as a potential opportunity, and they volunteered to help out in the training camps down in Egypt. Jewish expatriates also attempted to form a brigade. The idea was rejected, and then they formed an auxiliary support mule corps, which allowed them to have some kind of input. And their goal was to deliberately have, because the mindset of the time is if you were in any way a participant, in theory, it gave you the ability to potentially submit demands. So the goal wasn't entirely, because most of these are British citizens. Their goal is not just to be merely patriotic to the British Empire. They're hoping in the aftermath of the war they can say, well, we helped out. can we get some kind of concessions? One of the things the Allies discovered quickly was their maps didn't show how difficult the terrain was. The landing areas were narrow peninsulas with small beaches with very steep rocky hills. The Turks had nearly 2 months to prepare because they kind of saw the whole thing coming. And ultimately, both sides would pour in troops. The British Empire would throw some 500,000 troops in. The Turks would bring another some 300,000 to bear. Ultimate casualties were about 250,000 on the British side and another 218,000 on the Ottoman side. And it ended up being wholly inconclusive. Okay, so understanding the politics of the Middle East at this time. Because the Young Turks were ethno-nationalists, they were essentially strongly disliked outside the Turkish population of the Ottoman Empire. The Turks themselves were generally disliked by the rest of the Ottoman Empire, but not hated. Essentially, there were ethnic problems, disagreements that had gone back a long time. Obviously, every group kind of wants to be the one in charge. So, no, there was not a great love affair with like the Arabs back to the Turks. The Turkish Sultan was considered technically the Caliph of Islam, so he was a religious leader as well. And as Caliph, he called for jihad, and this call for jihad was pretty much ignored outside Turkey. There was a huge cultural divide between different groups of Arabs. If you were a city dweller versus a rural dweller versus being an actual nomadic Bedouin, each one of these groups had strong dislikes and prejudices against each other. Also, Arabs formed both tribes and clans, which made governing very difficult. It generally forced you to create many different alliances with different groups to make things work. Two of the major players in this, in terms of the Arabs, we have Ibn Saud of Riyadh. And essentially, he had resurrected a rather fanatical version of Islam, which had nearly died out. And he was fighting down in the lower part of the Saudi peninsula against various other clans and tribes. And the other major figure is Sharif Hussein bin al-Amir of Hejaz. Essentially, he's put in charge of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. So we start seeing the issue forming where, because Gallipoli had failed, they were looking for a different way to break the stalemate. And this is where it starts almost getting ludicrous, is that the different factions of the British government were making deals with different groups down in the Middle East, completely oblivious to what the others were doing. So, British India at that time was functioning almost as its own entity. Technically subservient to the British Empire and definitely loyal to the British Empire because of the distance. They got to run things in their own ways with a lot of autonomy. And so the British Indian government ended up making a treaty with Ibn Saud, essentially allowing him to grab any Ottoman territory he wanted to take. And at the same time, he would agree to not attack the emirs in Kuwait and the other places that the British already had control of. British India hoped to expand the land controlled by British India throughout the entire Middle East. If they didn't do it directly, they would do it through friendly kings and local royalty, very similar to what they had done with India. The British Indian Office specifically wanted to annex Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra, essentially modern day Iraq. So we have that part. Now, the Egyptian office approached Sharif Hussein in order to get him to perform an Arab uprising. They promised him he would become the Arab Caliph. The big thing is that Egypt did not understand that there was essentially a separation of powers. They believed that Sharif Hussein, since he was in charge of the holy cities, he was kind of like they believed he was the equivalent of like an Arab Islamic pope, when in fact his power was rather minimal. They also assumed he was popular, which he was not. And Egypt had a long-term goal, and I'm talking specifically British Egypt, the government that existed there, had a long-term goal of creating an Arabic empire modeled after India. And their idea was that Kitchener would end up being the head of it. So then, to throw into the mix there, so we have the Jewish homeland question comes up. Essentially, with the beginning of this Mule Brigade that was set up, the idea formed of possibly making more Jewish brigades because they were short on manpower, and anything that brought inspired troops who were not, didn't have their morale broken yet was, pretty much something they were interested in doing. They are also hoping that Jews who were fighting in the Russian army would be inspired by the idea of a promised Jewish homeland, and they would fight harder and help keep Russia in the war. Also, there was a significant minority of Jews in Germany. They were hoping that by announcing a Jewish homeland, that the German Jews would break ranks with the Germans and basically form some kind of fifth column, or at least drop their support for the Germans. And then, the best one of all, they thought for sure that by bringing up a Jewish homeland, it would be an appeasement to the Young Turks because of their Jewish background. That was originally reported by a British ambassador some years earlier. So there was a whole bunch of conflicts in this. First, the Sykes-Picot Agreement is a secret treaty. No one's aware of it. All the various groups throughout the Middle East are being promised independence. And they think that means, as soon as the war's over, we go free. Well, the European idea of independence is no, we rule you, and when we decide that you're mature enough to rule yourselves, then we will slowly, let out the leash until you can kind of run things on your own. The term Jewish homeland caused a lot of problems because in some cases people were looking at the biblical version of what Judea and Israel and everything looked like at its absolute height as an empire. So they were looking at a very expansive idea, whereas other people were thinking, oh, no, we were just looking at Palestine, and we're not really sure what exactly a homeland is at this point. Jerusalem was going to be an international city, and essentially you have, if you're promising the area of Palestine to the Jews, Jerusalem obviously being a very important city to them wouldn't be too keen on the idea of it being an international city. Ibn Saud was promised all the Ottoman territory he could take. Hussein was promised to be king of all the Arab lands. Saud and Hussein were rivals. Many Arabic leaders disliked both of them. British India wants Mosul and Basra, and these are areas that are essentially both promised to Hussein and France. Uh, and France had a bad reputation as a colonial power by this time. They were very brutal in many of the areas they wanted, and the only people who wanted the French coming in were the Maronites in Lebanon. Uh, Palestine, which should be the site of this Jewish homeland, at this point had already been promised to be split up between France and Britain. So lots of problems that need to be unraveled at this point.